Welcome to the Regenaissance Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Griggs. Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more. And alongside me today, I have Eric Perner from Rep Provisions. Thank you for joining me, Eric.
Yes, thanks for having me, Ryan. Appreciate it.
So, I know we just met today, and just from the brief bio you sent, it's the background is really interesting. And so, before digging into everything that you're doing currently, I would love to hear just your backstory leading up to what you're doing now, because you started in equestrian. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Right out of high school, I was working on a thoroughbred racehorse ranch, and at that time, I was about the right size. They said, "Hey, why don't you try riding, and become a professional jockey?" So I went and trained in California for a year to do that. Came back to the Midwest, rode kind of all over the country for about 10 years. So really developed an understanding of how to communicate with a large animal, right? So, previous to that, I did grow up on a cattle ranch, so I already had a bit of a background, but that really drove home this interesting concept between a man and horse trying to accomplish the same thing. So a predator riding a prey animal and communicating for the same goal, I always was fascinating to me. And how to talk to that animal just through your hands and accomplish the same goal was really a thrill for me. And so did that for 10 years. It was a great experience, but at time it does take a toll on the body. It can be brutal, maintaining weight, and then just kind of all the injuries that come along with it. I've broken so many bones along the way that it was time to make a change. And so I quit that cold turkey. I went back to college, always had this really great appreciation for nature and physics and, when we live in this amazing universe, when I look up in the sky and I see the heavens, I love to dream about that thing. So I went back and got an engineering degree. It ended up that engineering degree took me to the oil and gas exploration and production operations, and did that for 15 years. And that really taught me, number one, this kind of need for energy, but the consequence of trying to get that energy out of the ground, and really, begin to get worried after a while of the consequences of how we get our energy and how we produce energy, kind of a very kind of extractive means. And that led me to finding solutions for things to repair some of this damage that we've created, over time. And that led me back to my background in agriculture, and then beginning to understand how these natural cycles cycle carbon in massive amounts. And so that kind of took me to understanding and learning more about regenerative farming and ranching. That was just beginning to be a big hot topic. And it really inspired me to want to do things different and kind of want to live differently. So quit that job. I had my own ranch at the time, and I really began to develop this ranch that I'm at today around regenerative and holistic management principles. Those where carbon really cycles in this beautiful cycle of life. And I thought, this is a great idea, but how do I really take this to the masses of people and help it scale to not just mine, but to many millions of acres, ideally? And thought I'll create a brand around that. So that's where Rep Provisions, our direct consumer brand, was envisioned, and began that brand in 2020. And we've just seen every year that kind of business doubling. So we know we are resonating with that consumer from the perspective of health of the land is health for our bodies. And I think since COVID, these two components really are accelerating with the consumer, that these are important for us, and they're kind of demanding that product. They think, we meat gets all the time in the headlines that it's bad, that the methane from beef cattle are bad for the environment, that they damage the environment. But, that can be in certain cases, but in regenerative farming and ranching, using these natural principles, it's the exact opposite. The fact is, these large ruminants always coexisted in these natural cycles, and they were part of uplifting it. And so I really want to showcase that meat, like we can have our steak and eat it too. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be fake meat. It doesn't have to be, a full vegetarian diet, that we can have this, beautiful cycle in nature and really improve our environment through animals. It's part of how we manage ecosystems. And it's just taking this holistic approach of how we do that I think is critical to get people to understand.
That's great. That's a lot to unpack there. I guess to start, just taking it back to whenever you were growing up on a ranch, were you very hands-on, or what was that experience like?
Yeah, my dad, I mean, he was very much kind of, we had beef cattle, we had sheep, we had goats, we did everything, just off and on. And it was a very small farm. My dad was just a hobby farmer. But even back then, he instilled in me these regenerative farming principles, even before that was a thing. So he was kind of the one guy in our community that was doing things different. Like, he wasn't spraying fertilizer. He wasn't spraying pesticides. He was doing everything organic, and he really preached the importance of our native perennial grasses and forbs, how critical they are to soil health, and that you need to manage these things really well. So he was really, in some cases, in that age, this is in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, that he's kind of ahead of his time in these management principles. So he really instilled that in me. So that all came back full circle when he passed away, and then I started kind of managing my own ranch, and it just so happened at the same time these regenerative farming and ranching principles, which I learned as a kid, are now becoming more important, more than ever. And so it just shows me that my dad was always right all along, even though as a kid you think, what can I learn from him? But so that was kind of my story.
Do you know what, like, was he always that way, or how did he learn about those practices, or what made him make that decision? Because that at that time, I mean, that's way ahead of your time, essentially.
Yeah, no, it was complete opposite of what everyone was doing, and everyone thought he was crazy. How can you eat grass-fed beef? And so he really got criticized, but he didn't matter. He knew it was right in his heart. And I don't know how that came about. He grew up in the city, and so he saved his nickels and dimes from the time he was 6, 7 years old to purchase his own ranch. And it was just in him, I guess. I don't really know. He just knew the difference between right and wrong, and that's what he really staked his claim on, kind of how we manage land in conjunction with wildlife and in conjunction with our native perennial grasses and forbs and things of that nature. So I don't know what inspired him. It was just something inside of him that spoke to him deeply.
No, that's awesome. I guess to transition a little bit and going back to you're saying we can have our steak and eat it too, and just on the topic of a lot of the media and online is just really pushing climate change and the fact that animals are causing that, and they're the biggest driving force of climate change. And since you've extensively worked in the world of energy, and now you're working in regenerative agriculture, I was just hoping that you could just talk more on why that's not the actual true case. Why that's not actually the biggest reason. And in fact, you were saying the inverse could be true, because there are practices that are bad with animals that aren't good for the environment, but how you're going about it is not that. So yeah, I was hoping you could shed light on that.
Yeah, I think, I guess, one, address, the main thing. When you talk about climate change, it's super controversial. It seems as whatever your politics is what you believe is right or wrong, right? So I just to address that real quickly. I'm open. I believe I'm an open book. I don't have a definitive opinion, too solid one way or the other, but I use logic and reasoning to form an opinion, not from my news source or not from my political leader. As an engineer, that's just how I think critically about things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about anthropogenic climate change, so that caused by humans, which there is a huge debate on, you've got to step back and look at it a bit objectively and think about, okay, what is our atmosphere made up of, right? And we know roughly the atmosphere is made up of approximately 70%, 76% nitrogen, 23% oxygen. That's 99% of the gases in our atmosphere. 99%, of which those 99% do not have the ability to trap infrared heat. So we're only talking about that 1%, that extremely thin layer around the earth that actually controls everything, right? And so if you increase CO2, for example, or methane, it stands to reason even a small amount could make some changes. But we're not just doing small amounts, we're doing 100 million tons of CO2 daily. So over decades, you logically, you would think that might alter things. So I just accept the fact that probably we're having an effect on our environment and probably we are warming the environment. Now, the question we got to ask, what are the consequences of that? Those are things I don't know. And I think a lot of people can surmise that they know, but I don't necessarily believe that. But what I do know is that throughout history, that large numbers of animals existed on this planet in perfect harmony with our climate. And I would just urge people to go back, even in recent geological history, which is little as 10,000 years ago, which is nothing. That's a blip of time in geologic history, to the Pleistocene, in which ungodly massive numbers of, bison and different varieties of bison and mastodons and sloths and lions and horses and everything existed in North America on this prairie. And they were not causing climate change. They existed for thousands of years now. And that holds true even through, 10,000 post, when, Native Americans lived on this planet and millions upon head of bison roamed the prairies. So they really existed in this harmony with nature, which cycled nutrients in a really big way. One of those being carbon. And temperatures were stable. So we kind of know these things. So the fact to say that animals are causing climate change, we know is not true. Now, we can say our management of agriculture, extractive agriculture, and partly some animals can be part of that it could be causing some degree of increasing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So that I can accept. What I can't accept is, that animals are the sole cause. And just think of it in this way. In North America alone, there's roughly 400 million acres of agriculture monocrop land. So where you grow one crop, mostly corn and soy. And we think about that cycle of carbon in a cornfield, which, it may cycle carbon for, 4 or 5 months out of the year. And then that's it. It's only one crop is allowed to exist, and only that crop, not anything else. No grasshoppers, no bugs, no rabbits, no moles, no nothing. It literally that only one crop. So it's only adding carbon in that soil for a few months out of the year, then it's plowed and all that's released again. So that is not a good way to cycle nutrients in that soil or cycle life or carbon-based life. So I got to believe, like, comparing that to grazing beef cattle on native pasture, like, what's worse for the environment? And a lot of talk is we want to go vegan. Well, we're not thinking through this clearly, in my opinion.
No, and you brought up a lot of great points. I'm almost done reading Will Harris's book, and he mentions how whenever he was doing it conventional way, every single day he went out to his pastures to find stuff to kill. And that just him saying, like, just reading that in itself is just wild thinking, to where it's just so against nature, to where you just go out in nature, it's so diverse, and now you're just trying to have one crop, and everything else that used to exist there is essentially gone, and to make it as efficient and easy on you and to max yields, all of those things. And it's just interesting, the shift on that. But then also, you brought up a great point, just the Pleistocene era, because that I went down a huge rabbit hole and just learning about that era, and it's so fascinating, especially just with bison, the bison latifrons. Those are really cool animals. But in the 1800s, whenever the bison were roaming the Great Plains, you could be able to hear a stampede from a mile away. You could point your gun, and you're most likely going to hit a bison. And so, that's just wild that used to exist now, because now I remember growing up as a kid driving in the Midwest, because that's where I'm from. All you see is corn. And that's all I would say for miles and miles, is just corn, corn, corn. And that, obviously, we're seeing that the drastic consequences of all of that. And then that also just the quality of the food itself is not nearly as good. And I remember looking at the Rep Provisions website, you include a bunch of awesome graphs. So I'm curious, how did you go about the testing of that? And then why did you pick those specific, like the polyunsaturated fats and the omega ratios and those things? Those specifically, how did you go about deciding to have those on the website to showcase just anyone that goes there?
Well, because I think part of our poor health outcomes, which are severe in the United States, like a kid born today is more likely to have a chronic disease than not. I mean, this is sad. Everything's accelerating from heart disease to diabetes to all these things, and there's just no one could convince me otherwise that it's because of our diet. And when these shifts really started to accelerate, which I would, say, mid 80s or so, this is exactly the same time they came out with this thing called the food pyramid, which is a high carb, low fat diet. And the shift was away from animal fats. And so that's when, and then I think there's a nice, I mean, there's a pretty good correlation between our bad health outcomes and that food pyramid and a shift away from animal fats. And that shifted our diet towards low fat products. But what they replaced the animal fats with? They replaced it with corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil, all these things from these monocrops, which we talked about the negative outcomes from that. And what are these fats extremely high in? They're extremely high in omega 6s. And I think there's a very good connection for it, the way I understand it, that the human diet did not evolve on an omega 6 to 3 ratio of 30 to 1. It was probably 1 to 1. And this stands to reason. Like if we were, for the thousands of years of human evolution, we were foragers mostly, and we got what we could eat. And that came with meat and maybe seasonal berries and some tubers and things of that nature. But our omega 6 to omega 3 ratio was most likely 1 to 1. And so kind of reading between the lines there, it's not hard to believe that this polyunsaturated fatty acid, the omega 6 one, which tends to be more inflammatory for our bodies, is part of really bad outcomes. And I think we need to get back to animal fats. But I will say, I think we need to get back to the right animal fats. And other things we know, what shifts that omega 6 to omega 3 ratio higher is animals that are fed tons and tons of grain. So beef cattle who are spending the majority of their life on grass, but then the last 90 to 120 days are fed a straight grain diet, it really shifts that omega 6 to omega 3 ratio to a much higher, as much as 10 or 12 to 1. But we've measured straight off grass, our beef, and it is the perfect ratio 1 to 1. We also know that chicken and pork, that ratio gets shifted when they're fed large amounts of grain in concentrated operations, and that they can be as high as 25 and even 30 to 1 ratios of omega 6 to omega 3. So adding all that, plus all the low fat garbage and the seed oils and all that stuff, it's really skewed our diet heavily in omega 6s. But we also know when we raise animals such as pork and chicken on grass, even though they do get some grading, that ratio is going to be much lower than conventional operations. So really getting these things right, I think, has resonated with our consumer base, and folks like Paul Saladino and others really get that word out. And even it's one of these concepts, again, when you step back and you look at it, it just makes sense, right? I don't care what studies out there telling me low fat diet's good. That's bullshit, because we can see the obvious data that it's not. So I don't buy into that, but I can buy into logic and reason. And when you tell me humans evolved on an omega 6 to omega 3 ratio of 1 to 1, that's very believable. And we probably need to get back to that in our food choices.
Yeah, that's so spot on. Especially with kids, it's a shame that now 2/3 of their diet is ultra processed garbage. It's just
Yep.
absolute travesty, because not only is that just wreaking havoc on your body long term, but it completely alters your brain chemistry with food to where it makes you addicted. And because I worked on a farm last fall, 100% of my diet was on a farm. It's the first time in my life I've ever experienced anything like that. And it was maybe after 3 to 5 days, I stopped thinking about any of that junk. And it's not like I gave away taste because you can still make such delicious, nutrient dense food. Not only that, when you think of burgers, for example, or pizza, or even just fries, you can make that all in a healthy way if you have the quality ingredients. And that's one of the big things I want to do with Regenaissance is just raising awareness behind all of that. Because once you have that food, it really changes your perception of it all. Because I go back to this one specific meal I had last year at the first ranch I had visited, and my mouth still salivates to this day thinking about that because it just was so different than anything I had ever experienced in any grocery store in my life. And I mean, that's why we need to get back to that because the more you have that food, the less you'll think about the other garbage that is plastered on our face everywhere you drive, where there's just fast food everywhere. And so, yeah, it's a huge challenge with all that. And then another thing, you brought up a good point about the PUFA ratios for animals. That was very eye opening for me, especially with chicken, because they are a lot of the times they're fed high corn and soy and other grains. And you're right. I remember seeing graphs. It was up to 30 to 1, and that's whenever I've read that. I don't remember the last time I've really bought inside the grocery store for chicken, and definitely pork. That's a while ago, just because they are fed just horrendous diets from Smithfield Foods and others that are huge for the pork industry. But yeah, what you feed them is so crucial because you feed them unhealthy diets, they're unhealthy animals, and that's going to be unhealthy for us. And it's just a very vicious cycle.
Yeah, makes total sense. Yeah, and we've you know, the as far as pork production, we raise all ours on pasture where they have open access to grass, nuts, pecans. Yes, they still get some grain, but we have eliminated corn and soy, which we believe are the biggest contributors to that ratio. And the same with their chicken. We are eliminating corn and soy from their diets, and they are on pasture all the time. So that right there, while they are still fed, supplemented with some starches, we know that ratio is going to be much better just from the fact they're on grass and have open, access to grass, and getting their feet on grass immediately makes a huge difference.
So I'm curious that the feed, whenever you were deciding on what to feed and like supplement your pigs and chickens with, because it's also an interesting conversation just with the feed, because a lot of it is corn and soy, but I know there are trade-offs, and with financing and how much work goes into farming, it's very difficult. And I know for certain farms, the one I worked on, they did feed corn and soy for their chickens and others. But for one, it could be that's just the best available for them, the cost.
Yeah.
Um, there's just so much that goes into just all of that. So I'm curious, yeah, how'd you go about deciding what you supplemented your chickens and pigs with?
We so it's a huge challenge, and it's expensive, to get the right feed, because typically that's not what's been readily available. It just so happened that we had a guy in North Texas that could source for reasonable costs corn and soy free feed for us and our farming partners. So that just came about last year, and we jumped on it because I was like, oh man, I've been looking for this for years and couldn't find it. And so we found that, and we want to keep improving that and finding other ways and better feeds that keep improving upon that ratio. So that's but eliminating corn and soy was a big one. It was super difficult. It was going to be really difficult to do it economically, but we got that done. So that's step one. And we want to continue to, do research around what is the best diet for pork and chicken. And I think we're still coming to that. We're coming to a solution, a perfect solution, that we can get that ratio just like our grass-fed beef. Not quite there yet, but we are far better than the competition. I can tell you that.
So with rep provisions, how many? I guess, yeah. Can you just explain? Because I know you're saying it's a direct consumer and you source just from local farms. Um, I guess if you can just talk more on that process of, do you vet the farms and ranches before working with them? Do you continue to add new ranches and farms, or yeah, what's that process like?
Yes, so we kind of have our standard is we want to be regenerative farms and ranches, and so we vet all of our farms through a process called ecological outcome verification. This is developed by the Savory Institute out of Boulder, Colorado. And so we use that science behind understanding, is land really regenerating or not? So their land is measured every year through these ecological principles, and soil samples are taken every fifth year to measure changes in soil carbon. And so, yeah, it's is it the it's the best metric out there, but for us to have kind of actual kind of data on to track, and I think that'll evolve over the years, and it's changing rapidly on how we measure soil health, on how we measure ecosystem health, and we're going to stay up on the latest technology that allows us to advance that concept of regenerating land. But yes, these are conversations we have with our farmers before they get in that network. We say, hey, will you be committed to becoming, let us use ecological outcome verification on your land? And if they don't agree with that, then we don't even, it's not even worth talking about. But, for the most part, people love it because it gives them valuable data points, because if their land is improving, that's improving their bottom line. And so it's a win-win for the farmer network and for the consumer, in my opinion.
With that too, are you working together just to strategize and just especially just moving the needle and just the whole space of regenerative agriculture, because it's not a real, I mean, it's picking up a lot of steam. It's not a completely new term, but because I had first heard about it last January, and just comparing November 28th of this year to whenever I heard of it last year, it's crazy how fast it's grown. So I'm curious if with your network, um, yeah, do you work together in just terms of trying to improve each other's farms and ranches and just trying to work together? I didn't know what that relationship would be like.
Yeah, I definitely love to share learnings that I've taken away from my ranch. Say, hey, this has worked for me, and the other farmer network the same. Um, but yeah, constantly trying to kind of educate. When we visit these land bases, like, here's where you're weak here. If you made these changes, perhaps you'd have better outcomes. Not forcing anything on anyone right now, but kind of just gently nudging, like, some of these processes could really help you and cut your input costs. For example, like on my home ranch here, like I was on a big mission to not try to cut hay, right? Because it's so expensive. And part of my mission also is to, I feel like in a lot of the farms and ranches, there's just this concept of just blanket mowing your entire property with no sense or reason about why you're doing that. And it can be very damaging to grasslands. And so I've kind of staked my claim. I don't own a tractor, by the way.
Hmm.
I have an ATV that I get around everything. And I did that strategically because I don't want to be reliant on too much heavy equipment. Yeah, there's some parts that you do need, but I really don't want to use these really hurtful principles on land. I want to find other ways. So basically, how I manage my land now is we do rotational grazing with the cattle and the pigs and the goats in this kind of nice cycle. And then anywhere where I need additional impact, where I'm getting encroachment from woody species or blackberries or things that I need to kind of help knock back, we do controlled burns on strategic, patch burns. And that's all you need. And my grasses have improved. I grow green grass all winter now. And so this will be the first year, I believe, I'm going to make the whole year without any hay for the cattle. So they will graze strictly on these native perennial pastures with the underlying green, cool season grasses that grow under that canopy of the natives because they're insulated, so they continue to grow all year. So it's really been a great boon for me, but it's also been a great boon for wildlife. Just the amount of deer and birds that we have. We're a certified Audubon bird friendly ranch as well.
Hmm.
And just the volumes of life that exist here that literally do not, Ryan, they do not exist across the fence. They're, everything comes here because the habitat's here. And seeing this beautiful cycle between raising animals, making a living on the land, but still having all this incredible wildlife as well, really brings a lot of joy to a farmer and rancher to see that. And when you talked earlier about how farmers and ranchers, their whole life is, what do I need to kill today? That's hideously depressing to me. And I've seen a study, perhaps you've seen it, that farmers have some of the highest suicide rates, maybe for various reasons, but there's a lot of lacking joy there when your whole concept is, what do I need to kill today? I mean, I think it robs you of your joy and your health. And so this beautiful cycle with regenerative farming and ranching not only improves the land health, improves our body's health, it improves our psychological health. So I truly believe that because I feel it. And people who come out here also feel it. They're like, this just feels different. And it does. It brings this kind of really joy to you to experience it.
No, that's so great. I didn't even really think about that. I've gone back to this again, but Will Harris's book too, he was talking about he that was kind of one of his wake up calls to where he started noticing just the lack of nature, especially compared to his upbringing. And then whenever he switched to regenerative practices, and as time went on, that revamped up to where all the wildlife came back. And that has to be a really cool feeling, especially because if, like you were
Yeah.
mentioning, compared to your neighbors, that the fact that how they're going about it,
It's death.
it
It's pure
attract it,
silence. Yeah.
yeah, you either attract or detract. So I think that's just really interesting. And
And
go ahead.
yeah, well, I visited Will's. Several years ago, I was visiting. I had to speak there at White Oak Pastures, and Will gave me a tour of the ranch with some other friends, and he put me up in a little cabin that he has on a lake there, and I'll never forget when I unpacked my luggage to go to that cabin. Literally, there were just millions of bats swarming, and I was like, my God, it was incredible. Like, just the amount of life that existed there was amazing. So he's right. You see the difference, you feel the difference. It's a cool thing to see.
And that's why, I mean, the conventional practices, it's very anti-nature, and then nature
Very.
responds back to you to where now it's gone. And then on the flip side, whenever you work alongside nature, aka what you're doing and Will Harris is doing, nature responds back and it comes back in full force. And so I think that's such a beautiful thing. So you mentioned about controlled burning. I wanted to briefly talk about that because, again, for me personally, I was so disconnected with just the whole world of agriculture until essentially last year, and I didn't know too much about controlled burning. So I was hoping that you could talk more on that and why you did that and why it's an important thing to implement.
Well, I think partly, how this country of North America, the Great Plains specifically, evolved, that there's just no doubt fire was a part of that process, that it happened naturally. A dry season would happen, a lightning strike, and a huge blaze would take off and it would burn large. How often that happened, maybe we're less sure of, but we know it happened. And when humans kind of fenced everything off, and there's a fire department on every corner, and for good reason, but we don't allow any burns to happen, and this was always part of that natural cycle. So I'm just trying to bring back and replicate that natural cycle. But what I was telling you earlier is I'm trying to do anything to manage this property without putting heavy equipment on it, not adding more soil compaction, not mowing and wiping everything out in one fell swoop, but try any other way to management that I know is natural that will benefit it long term. And what I've seen is when I do these control burns, the grasses respond unbelievable, especially the native perennial grasses and the forbs, like how they come back overnight, like is incredible. Like I've never seen anything like it. So I know it works. Now that's not to say it can't be overdone, and too many people can overdo it. But when it's part of, a several year cycle, this is an extremely healthy thing that needs to happen. And another thing is, there's a lot of talk about how we've got to plant trees and we've got to have more forests, and all this kind of concept about planting more trees. I think there's a case to be made that the amount of trees that existed, especially during the Pleistocene, were nothing like we see today. Like it was sparse, it was grassland. And I think we've shifted far, at least in my part. I'm in the Cross Timbers ecoregion, at least here. I believe the volume of trees we have today are a lack of management and a lack of fire. So those things that suppress these woody species and really benefit the native grasses, we've shifted it where it's all trees. And there's even on my property, I find it continually. Like it's impossible without fire to keep it at bay. But the forests just choke themselves out, right? And then what I see in these closed canopy forests is bare soil, very limited life that can exist there. This should have been grassland under the right natural cycles, but is converted to overgrown, dense forest that isn't healthy. We can't grow food on it. So I think if we start shifting some of these areas back that weren't historically solid forests back to grasslands, this is how you scale regenerative farming and ranching. There's so much more available acreage out there, millions and millions of acres. But I think we've disrupted natural cycles so poorly that, and all we talk about is more trees, more trees. I don't know, Ryan. In my ecoregion, that's not the case.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. I mean, again, with regenerative agriculture, it's not one system fits all. You're supposed to understand the land that you steward. You're supposed to understand that the native species, as you talked about, the native grasses, because whenever you try to implement non-native grasses, then that actually messes up the microbiology of the soil, and that's how you can get all kinds of nasty weeds and everything else. Again, nature always responds. That's why I find this agriculture so fascinating, because if you actually pay attention, it makes so much sense why things happen the way they do. So yeah, I just wanted to add that tidbit. And on the topic of the Savory Institute, you've mentioned that, do you do education with the Savory Institute to where you're doing grazing education as well?
I have in the past. I've been so busy with so many other kind of operations that I'm working in that I haven't had the ability to do it. But yes, I have, and I'm a big promoter of theirs and a big believer. Like I said, I think Allan Savory is really the one that's kind of led. If you trace it back far enough, it was him. Even in the '70s, preaching about holistic management. So I really give him all the credit in kind of shifting us to a more regenerative future in farming and ranching.
What was the education like? Were folks just coming to visit and you're just essentially showing hands-on principles from that?
Yeah, they do, and we do. We have get-togethers with social media influencers, and we do some teaching and training. But the bigger goal of my ranch was to be an education center where I would bring in other farmers and ranchers and train them on the methods of holistic management. Unfortunately, life gets in the way, and that dream's going to be pushed to the side for now. But that's part of the bigger vision, is that we can begin to develop trainings for farmers and ranchers to shift regenerative practices. Another group that I'm also deeply involved in, and I'm on their producer panel, is the Noble Research Institute, which is also training in regenerative farming and ranching principles, a great organization that I'm deeply involved with as well. And they're just south of me in Ardmore, Oklahoma. So they're another great resource, and their sole goal is to train farmers and ranchers in regenerative farming and ranching methods, and they're doing amazing work as well.
Is that for that already current farmers and ranchers, or folks that are interested, like all the above?
All of the above. Yeah. Yeah. And
That's
they
really
work with a
cool.
lot of existing ranchers, but yeah, they're having great progress. They've got a great training already mapped out for folks that want to participate and learn more. So yeah, these groups are beginning to expand. So that's really exciting, because we need the training component to show people how to manage more regeneratively and get the science backed behind why it's important and why it's helpful, from an economic standpoint and a soil health standpoint.
That's a good point on the training specifically, because one of the ranchers I visited last year, I remember talking to him in Colorado, him mentioning multitude of times where it's also interesting with our society right now, and a lot of people are starting to wake up to not happy with where they're at in a major city, unfulfilling work, and then seeing the push of agriculture and the topic of just getting off the grid or living in a rural area and having your own land to work. And then he mentioned a lot of times people did exactly that, but they didn't realize how difficult the work actually is. And they lasted maybe like a year, and then they sold the land, or they just stopped actually doing farming and still live there. So that's the critical component is huge for that too, because then that just really sets them up well whenever they want to start their actual farm or ranch or hobby farm.
Yeah.
And so that's great. And that was called, what was that called again?
Noble Research Institute.
Research Institute. Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, mention you did mention people going to land getting frustrated because of the amount of work it is. I mean, this is true. It is, and we need to work on that quality of life component to get young farmers interested. Um, and while I am a big believer though that yeah it doesn't have to be overly burdensome on work, although it maybe is from the start. Sorry about that. Uh, um, wasn't expecting. Anyway, what I would say is that we've got to get to a point where that quality of life improves, and that technology can be a part of this, helping facilitate a better quality of life for regenerative farmers and ranchers.
With technology, then, I'm trying to think how I can phrase this question. I guess, how do you see technology helping that, and I guess easing the burden of the folks?
I think there's things I'm working on. There's things other folks are working on. Part of the biggest hurdle is how do you manage large herds on land and move them in a regenerative manner, and every day. So there's other things that are coming, I believe, that will help facilitate the movement of large herds in a regenerative manner where it doesn't require humans involved, and that they can be remotely monitored, and that soil health can be remotely monitored through lots of different things, and through AI, and through satellite based systems. So these things are progressing very, very quickly. And I would just say, and there's a huge shift in technology happening. I know you see it. It's talked about every day, and it's happening at an unreal pace. What I would say is regenerative farming and ranching needs to be a part of that and use it to its advantage. The fact is, we had another big boom in technology in the 1950s, right? All this access to fossil fuel, huge equipment, but we use that technology probably not in the best way to wipe out all the land. Let's use this next jump in technology in more of a holistic way and think about how it can benefit nature and kind of merge it together that it benefits it. So that would just be my case for using technology, but in the right way this time.
I love that, and especially, I mean, the education and awareness will have to be vital for that, because then with the advancement of technology, the big players that are already making this whole industry more centralized and um, doing it the unnatural way and worsening our land could be using that to
Yeah,
advance that even more. And so that will be interesting to see how that plays out. Because I agree, I think that could be really huge, and there's so much potential to help make your ranch more efficient, but not in the way that conventional agriculture tries to make their place more efficient. It's actually
correct.
beneficial to the land, and so that's great. So the last topic that I really had to with rep provisions, from the consumer standpoint, are they able to uh, figure out whenever they buy from you which farm or ranch that's coming from?
So because we're pretty small, we only source from right now about 5 different family ranches. Majority of the beef comes from me and one other ranch. Majority of the pork comes from me and one other farm. And we talk about and the chicken comes from one farm. So we're not big enough now that you can mostly know where it came from at any given time, even though we don't specifically trace it back yet. That is a bigger vision. It takes capital to do that, but I want to be able to folks be able to scan a barcode on their product and go to that ranch, know something about the soil health, know about that farmer, that rancher, where it was raised, how the animal was raised. But it'll take me time to get there. That is part of the bigger vision, though, and I think it's possible through technologies, just like we talked about. Through this iPhone, I can communicate with our customers every day if I want. They can order. So that's part of using technology now for small farmers and ranchers to get their product to market, where this was not possible before. And I think partly because we didn't have this access to customers is why we ended up in such a centralized system, because you had to do it that way. You didn't have any choice. Nobody knew, how to get the food, but now we know how to do that. So that's going to be, that's really going to move the needle for these small farms and ranches. But we need these aggregators like Rep Provisions to help facilitate that, because everyone's expertise is not marketing and building a website and direct to consumer, but it is farming. it is ranching. So we need to communicate these with these brands like Rep Provisions that are trying to do it the right way.
I love that because I did a podcast with Amy Hay about a week and a half ago, and her she does, I think it's called Sell Beef Direct in Canada, and I didn't realize how little in America that actually is a thing. I think she mentioned 8 or 9% total sells their beef direct, and that blew me away.
Mm.
So that's really cool that you're
Wow.
doing that, and I love the vision that you have for all that. Especially with blockchain, I'm a huge proponent of blockchain,
Mm-hmm.
specifically with the tracking aspect, because different industry, but say you buy jewelry, you have no idea where that came from,
Mm-hmm.
what practices that took to get that, and all and things like that. So that actually would be awesome for agriculture's sake too, and that
I
would be cool to
agree.
see. The last thing I had too, I know I mentioned this beforehand, to anyone that's interested, I've bought this way before I reached out to Eric about the podcast. Their products are amazing, and I actually had cooked his 90-10 beef with a couple of friends this past weekend, and they actually were raving about it a lot. And so that's, even just that too was really cool to have that conversation with them. The fact that it wasn't just some beef that I'd bought from Whole Foods, it was from a regenerative source that does it right, and they could clearly tell. And that was just one simple conversation. So just thinking about that, how that could, just having those conversations consistently with your friends, and as time goes on, it's really awesome. And so thank you for everything that you're doing, and thank you for coming on. If you just wanted to plug any of your website or social media or anything like that, you can go ahead and do that.
Yeah, people can find us on Rep Provisions on Instagram, Facebook, and then also www.eatrep.com is our website. You can see kind of all the products that we have listed and order direct off that website, and then we'll ship it straight to your door. A lot of people think, yeah, how do you ship, meat? Well, it's not too hard. We can get from anywhere in Oklahoma, which is where we're located, our fulfillment center, and reach anywhere in North America in 2 days or less. So super convenient if you want high quality meat, nutrient dense meat with the right fat ratios. Then you got to order from a company like Rep Provisions that's doing it that way. And I think, I would just say that, if your health is important to you and the health of the planet is important to you, then you need to search out and find these brands like Rep Provisions.
I agree. Well, thank you for joining, Eric.
Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it so much.
Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more.